Restoring the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor-Rubenstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restore the culture together.
Welcome to another episode of Restoring the Culture. This is Tanya, and today Camille and I are going to be talking about creativity and restoring creativity, whatever that means to us. So I have two quotes today. The first one is by Stephen Pressfield, and it's from one of my favorite books on creativity, The War of Art. The amateur believes he must first overcome his fear, then he can do his work. The professional knows that fear can never be overcome. He knows there is no such thing as a fearless warrior or a dread-free artist. I love that line, a dread-free artist. And the other is just a one-line quote from the amazing musical Rent by Jonathan Larson, which is simply, the opposite of war is not peace, it's creation. So with that, Camille, I'd love to hear, we never read the quotes to each other ahead of time. We just sort of riff on them. So what comes up to you about either one of those quotes or both?
Oh, I think, for me, the word creativity has always tripped me up a little bit because I could never call myself an artist. And somehow I think of the word artist being connected to creativity. And I do think I'm a highly creative person, but I think the way that my art comes out it's different. It's in the way that I think and the way that I feel and the way that I sort of follow the breadcrumbs in life and put things together in a way that is, I think I'm a synthesizer. And I think that that's a creative process for me. There's another part of creativity, and I'm not quite sure why this comes up for me, but it's very Dionysian, where it makes me kind of want to let my hair down, or I think of myself as a creative, and I think of my wild side that I don't let out often enough. And I think it's interesting that as I've been thinking about this podcast, that's a lot of what's been coming up for me is the ability to give myself permission to not follow the rules.
Follow your inner directive or energy or longing.
There's I have a wild part of me.
You totally do.
Right, that most people don't see.
We wouldn't be such close friends if you didn't.
And I don't know why the word creativity somehow it's bringing that out. I think it needs to come out because I'm in isolation right now.
It's sort of funny to me to hear you talk about creativity in that way and your identification or lack thereof as an artist. Because I definitely identify first as an artist in my soul, no matter what else I'm doing. And I do think there's something, and you and I have talked a lot about this, right? The intersection of art and consciousness. And I think it's creativity that allows us to come to those intersections and I've heard one definition of creativity is I'm going to get this wrong, but it's basically all the different ways. Will you just use the word synchronize, right? Or synthesize, a way of synthesizing information. But it's very funny to me because something I know about you that many people don't is what an amazing writer you are, specifically what an amazing poet you are. Though you're a closet poet, you're an amazing poet, and I've read your poetry and I think it's amazing and profound. And I see the artistry in everything you do, the way you cook, your home, how you care for people. And I think sometimes maybe we need to restory the word artist, because artistry to me is a way of viewing the world, not simply a form. So the forms we attach to artist are usually writer, actor, painter, sculptor, the dancer, the traditional forms. And yet, to me, it's about really the artistry of life, which I see you being such a actualized artist in.
Thank you. I mean, I really do feel that I think I feel very creative in how I love. And I feel creative in how I unfold my soul.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way of saying it.
Yeah, there's like artistry and creativity that for me has to do with the energy of intimacy, love, and having this embodied soul experience. And you are such an artist and such a creative. I mean, it's really your platform in life. And so for me, it's like it's with you. It's how I know you in every way. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what creativity means to you right now, especially right now, like as we're sitting here in the middle of this pandemic. And I wonder about that, there's also creative dissonance, how the pebble in the shoe that we're walking around with, it's aggravating all of us on some level right now. And how is that being interpreted through the channels of creativity?
Such a great question. For me, I would be dead. I would have been dead a long time ago without my creativity. And I mean that literally. So I'm definitely one of those people who says such and such saved my life. I remember Natalie Goldberg in one of her books, or she had an essay, How Poetry Saved My Life. My creative process is as natural to me as breathing. And I don't think about it because I'm engaged with it, I think, in every decision I make and moment. To me, creativity is a process of being alive. And it's the lens through which I stay alive. And the times I've gotten depressed in my life or anxious or experienced a trauma, it was made worse or better by how much I could access my creativity. And only once, when I had really severe panic attacks, and you remember this, I think, I was going through a divorce with my daughter's father. He had just been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The way it manifested in my body was to have these terrible, debilitating panic attacks where literally I'd stand up from my bed and faint and have to crawl to the bathroom. And the worst thing that happened to me during that time, because I couldn't sleep, was I couldn't access any of my creativity. I'm somebody who writes every day, even if it's a scribble. I'm not talking about writing for a book, but I write every day. I write everything down. I speak. I process aloud and through writing. And I do create work, art, even if it's a Facebook post, like a Facebook post I'm creating. And during that time of acute anxiety, I was unable to create. And I could only just lay there, or I could watch a movie. I would watch Hedwig and the Angry Inch over and over. It was the only thing that brought me comfort about a German, transgender German musician. And that gave me comfort because Hedwig just could be wild and out there and gave me the sense of comfort. It was funny because other people I knew felt disturbed by that movie, and that brought me comfort in time of crisis. So, and that's, I think creativity is like honoring our own wiring. In terms of this time, it's my biggest resource as a leader. It's what allows me to keep bouncing along the waves of life. And I believe that this is the gift of creative process and practice when we embrace it. So it's like my mind, or my being, I should say. It's not only my mind, but my creative being engaged is constantly seeking expression a solution to problems. And there's a way that my own artistic voice manifests that is both about intimacy and resiliency. So it keeps my mindset focused on a way to serve, a way to express, something I can write that is going to be supportive. It supports me because it allows my expression to come through, and that's how I process my life and integrate aspects of myself. But some of my creativity goes out there and serves, whether I'm creating a program for clients or directing a show, or right now you and I are creating a program, a writing circle that's going to go out globally. Like for me, my creativity connects with my ability to serve in my family, my friends, my daughter, myself, and the world. And it's the process itself, and not everything has to get done or even completed, but I see it as a way of being in the world. And I think it's something I teach. I believe it's for everyone. I truly believe that everyone is born creative and has access to creativity, whether they've been validated in it or not may inform how they have an identity or not around being a creative or an artist of some kind, or that they see themselves as a creative in however their life manifests. But I believe everybody has it. I don't think that Western culture, and certainly the way schooling is done, affirms it enough, because we idolize the intellect and we marginalize creativity. It's another part of the hierarchical process. But I think that's also been changing a lot, right? Because so many studies have come out, and now organizations and companies have seemed to finally have caught up to this idea that it's like creativity is the resource. Creativity is the resource that moves the needle on any process. What do you think about that in terms of creativity and organizations, or creativity and how structures can benefit from bringing more creative process in?
Well, I think that there's sort of a paradox that almost verges on an oxymoron there, because I think the trick with organizations is that you don't try and monetize creativity, or that you don't try and make it become a product, because I do believe that creativity is linked to the soul. And so how is it that we have room for the soul in organizations? Which is, how do we have room for intimacy? How do we have room for reciprocity? And I had a really interesting conversation today, actually with my analyst. We were talking about, one of the archetypal patterns that I have a tendency to sort of, that I'm working with. Let's just say I'm working with that my whole life, right? Probably. And it has to do with my sort of an ancestral imprint. And that is sort of the Valkyrie, which is, sort of this soulless, angelic being whose job is to act on behalf of her father's bidding, right? So she's sort of like, one example he used is Geppetto, who creates Pinocchio. And then Pinocchio's journey of going from becoming a wooden puppet to becoming a real boy, or the Velveteen Rabbit, from becoming the stuffed animal to becoming, a real live rabbit. And I had an experience recently with a friend who I do some co-presencing work with, and I found myself, sort of this process of learning how to give and receive. And I realized I'm really good at giving, right? Which is, of course, sort of the Valkyrie nature, the hospice nurse,
totally.
The oldest daughter, all of that. Not so great at receiving. And because I'm experiencing this now in a more regular way, I found myself actually saying, wow, is this really real?
Wow.
Is it really real that I'm experiencing this exchange of energy in this way? And then to be told, yes, this is real. And I kind of thought, wow, there is, in this practice that I'm involved in, there is this waking up, I think, that is happening for me in terms of, becoming more and more human and becoming more and more ensouled.
Yes.
Making room for my own soul and becoming embodied. And it's all of those things, because creativity is the antithesis of working on someone else's behalf.
Right.
Creativity really is this inner spring. It's where alchemy turns into the living waters.
And it's first for us before it's shared. And sometimes
Exactly.
It's never shared, but it's first for us, even if it's shared.
And it's brilliant. So any organization that could make room for creativity, it's like you found a gold mine. But then how do you have leadership that can work with that kind of
not exploit
energy
it and not exploit it, but
and
rather
not exploit
honor
it and not
and
shut it down,
exactly,
or compartmentalize it, or I think that's the challenge. So yeah, for me, I'm realizing that's definitely a process that I'm moving into in a deeper way, and it's really it's a beautiful thing. I've often said our job is to live as a human being before we die.
Yeah, completely. And
it's just right.
Yeah, and I do think creativity and the arts are about embodiment and soulment, like you said. And I think we've idealized enlightenment to get out of the body, to transcend the body. And it's like, why do we come here in these bodies if the first job is to transcend them? What about getting, like you said, ensouled in them, embodied in them? And to me, it's about the feminine, and it's about the connection to our bodies and this earth and all artistic practice. I know it as with a background as an actor, a trained actor, is all about embodying. And you can't embody another character without embodying yourself. That's part of the training, right? Dancers, it's even if we're reaching for the divine, it's then bringing it into the body, the earth, to communicate and express it. So it's an amazing practice. And I also think about how receiving is the energy of the feminine, the giving, and especially those of us who have been conditioned to be over-giving, right? Which is certainly women in the culture. Not that it's all a gender thing, but over-giving, like reaching beyond our human body capacity to do, like you said, this big Valkyrian thing, this big superhuman thing. I'll just be it's why I don't even like it really when women use the word the goddess. I don't want to be a goddess.
I agree with you.
I want to be a woman.
I want to be a woman, right?
I want to be a woman on this earth, and yes, connected to the divine aspects. But I got to tell you something really interesting on this. The first time I met you, and you were a hospice nurse or becoming one, I can't remember. This is 20 years ago.
Yeah, it was. I was just becoming one.
You were becoming one, but I somehow knew you were a hospice nurse. We'd had a few conversations. We might have even begun working together a little bit on the monologue project we did, and hospice monologues. I can't remember. It was in the first year or two. And I actually think I verbalized this to you. I said, I think I'll be okay dying as long as I have you by my side, because you were so angelic, like Jessica Lange and all that jazz, who played the angel of death. And she was beautiful and blonde, like you are beautiful and blonde. And this is 20 years ago, and like so comforting in your disembodiment. So talk about projection. I felt like I could die. And I know all these people around you were like, yes, I can die if I'm around Camille, who's like this angel. And then you were this hospice worker, but you paid a price for that around your own creativity. I know you did. I know
Absolutely.
you did, because you've talked about it. Can you talk more about that and how what it's like to come, like what is the juxtaposition? What's brought you back into your creativity, and how did you validate that projection and then also release it to become more human and more a woman in your body?
Well, I think it started with becoming really sick. I mean, I was really overworked and went through extreme burnout in healthcare, and had some health stuff come up I was misdiagnosed, and I unplugged from healthcare, and basically was just sort of in a hermit state for a year. You remember that?
I do.
And I think in that year, I differentiated myself from those roles.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I went through the withdrawal of what it meant to be the angel.
Mm-hmm.
I went through the withdrawal of being somebody's nurse,
Mm-hmm.
of being somebody's manager, of being the good girl, of being the healthy, emblem of a human woman. I mean, I went through so much letting go in that year where so much of those images dissolved and died. And I think in that time, in that year, in that process of rediscovery, a lot of what happened for me was I was taking long walks in nature. That was sort of part of my healing process, was just spending hours and hours out in nature and having incredible experiences with plants and animals. And I think it was my connection to nature that helped me come back into my creative, embodied, and souled human self,
Yeah, totally. I do know. It's interesting. On the last podcast, you read Dr. Clarissa Pinko's Estes, and you've been in Jungian training for a while, and I've been exploring more and more the role of archetypes and myths. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what you think about, as we're talking about like restoring creativity. One thing, I've had an experience of the archetypes opening up a wildness in creativity, even though my whole sort of gestalt has been around personal narratives. There's something to me about the mythic and the archetypal. And when we touch into the mythic or archetypal and can relate them to our own stories, there's a creative expansion, I think, around how we can work with our material. Have you had that experience? Because it's been something that I've been really into lately and finding potential in.
I certainly have, and I've also been warned about the dangers of that. So I think it's both potent, and there's a lot of energy and creativity there. And I think the thing we have to be careful of is not identifying with the archetypes. Mm-hmm. So every archetype has its light and its shadow, and we certainly can start to track which archetypes are really alive in our lives and in the relational fields around us. And that's a really good thing to learn from. But it's dangerous to identify with the archetypes because that takes us then away from our humanity in a way. Right? So I think it's both. I think it's being aware of them. But the other thing about archetypes that I find interesting from a constellation standpoint is and Jung talked about this, it's like finding your myth.
Yes.
And finding your myth that's within your cultural complex.
Yes.
So for me to, as a Northern European woman, American woman, like if I were to all of a sudden develop this strong connection with African mythology, there wouldn't necessarily be anything wrong with that. But I would have to be really careful about it taking me away from my own myth.
Absolutely. And it's also about white women in particular appropriating Indigenous people and other people globally who also carry the suffering that goes with their myths and a particular type of suffering and marginalization to not appropriate, right? And there's a difference between being inspired by and appropriating too. So you and I have talked about this returning. We both have Celtic heritage in us. We have a lot of that Northern European. You have Swedish as well. So like the return to that, how does that make us more human and at the same time more open creatively to our identity, I think, or how we view ourselves?
Well, and I think that when we learn about the myths of our cultural heritage, we can learn a lot about where we come from too. And, where the suffering has been, where the withhold has been, where the limitation has been, and where our ancestors sacrificed so that life was passed on. And I think when we can look at it through that lens and we start to acknowledge the truth of what is, we free up the past and we free ourselves to, it's really a contradiction, a seemingly contradiction, that's a healing movement of the soul, to honor the heaviness and the guilt of the past and to embody that in a way in the present moment where you acknowledge that this is where I come from and these people pass life on to me, and that I take my life with all that it cost them and with all that it cost me. And when we can really say that and stand in that, something in us becomes stronger. Mm-hmm. And from that, it's almost like a sprout within us comes out, and it's a new creative, authentic expression of our lineage that we then get to walk out. But we don't walk it out by cutting off from the past. We walk it out by accepting.
And bringing that in as a layer, right? As a total acknowledgement of a layer of our own story, all of it.
And that's freeing. And creativity is about freedom.
And what I think about too is, and you and I have talked about this, we're multidimensional beings with multidimensional, multi-layered stories. Our stories, generational stories, our own unique stories in this lifetime, and the way it connects to the web of life. And to me, like creating our own myths in a way, by retrieving all these pieces and then reweaving it as our own story, is the ultimate act of creation here, of creativity, of that it transcends form. It's the creation of our beingness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. What do you want for yourself in the future in terms of creativity? How do you see that? Can you feel what your soul is longing toward?
Yeah, I really can. My soul is really longing towards some sacred structure in my creativity in the form of a book. I think 2 books that are just mine. I had 3 shows that were just mine. I have 1 book that was an anthology that was just my people. Now, I shouldn't say just, but it was their stories with me editing and writing the foreword. But it's really, my soul is longing for a book. I think my teacher self, the teacher part of the artist, the teacher healer self, really wants a book very codified of my work in the world and the process. But what my soul wants is really the love story of me and my husband, called Skirting the Binary. It's our love story. It's about my sexuality. It's definitely about my creative choices and living pretty far outside of prescribed cultural boxes, and the joy I found there. And that's the story that I'm really, and I've been working on and off and on for about 1.5 years, but there's a longing to complete it. And I know for me that one of the gifts of artistic structure and creative completion is there's a huge movement of the soul in it, a huge piece of life's work done when we finish one of those big projects. So on a personal level, that's what I'm longing for creatively. And as we talk about it, it makes it my commitment more real to finish it. What about you?
Yeah, it's really an interesting question, because I find that there's part of me that feels very quiet and in process around some of the training and the learning that I'm going through right now, that I know is that like something is gestating. And so it's not time for me to really bring that out. And it's not even mine to know what the end result is going to be. And so there's a lot, I feel like for me, a lot of my creativity is being held in the mystery, in the dark. There is part of me that with my constellation work that, I've created a training manual, and I also have a death and dying book that's almost done. Those 2 things are sort of like right there, and they're sitting there. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a leaning into those 2 projects. Mm-hmm. But I don't feel the kind of fuel that tells me this has to happen in this way right now. And I'm trying to just trust the timing of things.
Oh, yeah.
I also think that a lot of my creativity right now is, it's really holding the tension of opposites. And it's really learning, deepening the artist in me that is able to work with creative dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm finding that in some of my personal relationships right now.
Mm-hmm.
Really transitioning what it means to be a mother of adult children in their 30s. What does it mean to be a grandmother? Like all of those things. I feel some of my relationships changing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think this feels really creative. This was a big step for me to for you and I to say yes to doing this podcast. I'm very committed to this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm my creative process.
Yeah, totally.
Like moving into wholeness is
Yeah.
right? That's kind of where my energy is.
Totally. And I mean, that gets back to, right, creating our own myths, creating our own lives, being here, embodied, all these threads. And what an amazing opportunity. Like, to me, that's the juiciest process of all. It's our own creative weaving. And I love that. And I love these creative conversations because I know when you and I get on and do these podcasts and the commitment to it, we're sharing with others, yes, but we're having creative process with ourselves and each other. And in the conversation itself, going deeper, with ourselves and our work, learning more, getting another piece of the puzzle that gets to be integrated or released somewhere.
I think there's another thing for me that I'm working with that has to do with myself as a hermit and as an introvert. And then the other part that has this strong calling to speak to big groups of people and how much I thrive in that environment and what a juxtaposition that is, and not knowing what that would look like. And it's not about being famous or even really being visible. It's that something in me connects inside around love when I'm speaking truth in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the bigger the audience is, the more love I feel coming and going. And that's a creative process for me. So I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but I can feel that in my own field.
Yeah, totally. And I think that bigness is a bigness in your soul that only gets met in that outer bigness. Mm-hmm. And I think we all have things like this, and there's no good or bad, right? As my friend, David Bedrick talked, he wrote a post recently. He's a psychotherapist, process worker, really brilliant guy, but something about if some of us are designed, like a hummingbird, and some like an eagle, like he was using all these metaphors, the oak and the acorn. And it doesn't matter big or small in a worldly sense, but it means that these pieces of our soul want to be creatively met. So if there's a part of you that thrives in that bigness, it will be met in that outer bigness, and another part that is small and introverted and quiet and wants to be met in a different way. I think creative living for me, or integration, is how many aspects of myself do I allow myself to manifest on the outer? How many pieces do I reclaim that I give myself permission to have expression of in the world?
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a creative conversation.
For sure. Always is. Anyway, thank you, Camille. I look forward to our next one.
Yeah, me too. Okay.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restoring the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restoring the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.